The Silent Watcher. It started with a snowstorm, the kind that buried the world in a cold, suffocating silence. The small, desolate town of Hollow Creek was blanketed in white, the streets eerily empty, except for the occasional flicker of light in a window. Earlier that day, children had built snowmen, their laughter carrying through the frosty air. By nightfall, however, the laughter had faded, replaced first by whispers and then by an unnerving quiet. The snow seemed heavier somehow, pressing down on the town like a shroud. Marla, a single mother, tucked her son, Toby, into bed. She reassured him not to fear the howling wind that rattled their windows. The storm outside was fierce, the kind that made the world feel like it had shrunk to the size of their small home. Outside, a snowman stood in their yard. Its coal-black eyes seemed fixed on the house, watching. Toby had built it that morning with childlike enthusiasm, but now it looked different. Its crooked grin stretched unnaturally wide, and its stick arms appeared to angle closer to the window. The sight sent a chill down Marla's spine, but she brushed it off as her imagination. That night, Marla woke to a strange scratching noise. The sound was faint but persistent, like nails scraping against glass. She lay frozen in her bed, listening, her pulse quickening with each passing second. Gathering her courage, she tiptoed to Toby's room, dread building with each step. His bed was empty. Her heart raced as she spotted small, wet footprints trailing toward the front door, which stood slightly ajar, snowflakes drifting inside. Grabbing a flashlight, she stepped out into the freezing night, calling for her son. The snowman was gone, but a jagged path marred the otherwise pristine snow. She followed it, her breath visible in the frigid air, each exhale a fleeting puff of desperation. The trail led her to the edge of the woods, where she saw Toby. He stood motionless, his small frame illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight. His face was pale, his expression blank, as though he were in a trance. "Toby!" she screamed, sprinting toward him. But as she reached him, he turned to face her. His eyes were no longer his own, but lifeless orbs of coal, glinting eerily in the moonlight. The snow beneath her feet began to shift, and icy hands erupted from the ground, gripping her legs. She struggled, her screams tearing through the night, but the hands were unyielding, pulling her down into the frozen earth. Toby watched, unmoving, as the snow swallowed her whole. The next morning, the townsfolk discovered Marla's house, abandoned. Toby was gone too. In the yard stood a snowman, its crooked grin even wider, and its stick arms outstretched, as though beckoning someone new. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than ever. Frostbite. David cherished the solitude of the mountains, especially in winter. He'd rented a remote cabin to finish his latest novel, far from the distractions of city life. The snow-covered peaks and dense forests provided the perfect backdrop for his creative process. On his second day there, as he gathered firewood, he noticed something peculiar in the clearing outside. An enormous snowman stood there, tall and imposing. He hadn't built it, nor had anyone else come to the cabin since his arrival. The snowman unsettled him. It was unusually tall, nearly 8 feet, with unnervingly lifelike features. Its eyes weren't made of coal, but gleamed like icy gemstones, reflecting the pale sunlight. Its grin was sharp and jagged, almost predatory. As David moved around the cabin, those eyes seemed to follow him. He tried to dismiss the sensation as paranoia, but unease settled in his chest, like a weight he couldn't shake. That night, as he sat by the fire, a faint thud echoed through the cabin. He froze, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time, like something heavy striking the wall. Telling himself it was just snow sliding off the roof, he forced his attention back to his writing, but the sound continued, persistent and deliberate. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Peering out the window, he saw nothing but darkness and falling snow. Yet, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, the snowman had moved. It stood closer to the cabin, its head tilted slightly as if observing him. David's unease deepened. He inspected the area but found no tracks leading to or from the snowman. It had simply moved. He spent the day trying to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the snowman. By evening, the oppressive silence of the mountains became unbearable. As night fell, the tension in the cabin became suffocating. He bolted the door and windows, determined to keep whatever was out there at bay. But the thuds returned, more insistent and deliberate. When he finally peered outside, the snowman was at the porch, its icy eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its grin, sharp and jagged, seemed to widen as it loomed closer. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint, raspy whisper he couldn't understand. Gripped by fear, David armed himself with a knife and sat vigil by the door, the fire burning low behind him. Exhaustion eventually overcame him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. He awoke to the bitter chill of an open door. Frost covered the floor, and in the center of the room was a handprint, a chilling mix of ice and blood. The snowman was gone, but David's footprints led deep into the woods, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. Search teams found his body days later, frozen solid. His face was contorted in a scream, his eyes wide with terror. The snowman was never found, but whispers of its return haunted the mountain village for years. Locals avoided the area, their fear growing with each passing winter. The Whispering Snowman. In the quiet town of Black Hollow, winters came with an air of foreboding. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the Whispering Snowman, a sinister figure tied to a chilling legend. According to the tale, anyone who built a snowman in the town square and stood before it at midnight would hear it whisper their darkest secrets. In exchange for fulfilling their deepest desires, the snowman demanded a price, one far greater than anyone was prepared to pay. Many dismissed the story as a myth, but whispers of disappearances lingered. Lila, a curious and skeptical teenager, dismissed the legend as mere superstition. When her friends dared her to test it, she accepted without hesitation. Together, they built a towering snowman in the square using shards of obsidian for its eyes and a jagged branch for its twisted smile. At midnight, her friends watched from the shadows as Lila stood before the snowman, her breath visible in the freezing air. The temperature plummeted, and an unnatural stillness enveloped the square. Lila's courage faltered as the snowman's mouth began to move. A faint, raspy voice filled her ears, speaking secrets she had never shared aloud. It unearthed fears she hadn't known she harbored, exposing her deepest vulnerabilities. "I can take it all away," the snowman whispered. "Say the word, and it will be done." Terrified, Lila backed away, but the snowman's grin widened. "You've already made the deal," it hissed. The next morning, Lila's friends found her huddled in the snow. Her hair was streaked white, and her eyes were hollow, unfocused. She refused to speak, save for a single chilling phrase: "He's coming for you next." Over the following weeks, the snowman reappeared outside her friends' homes. Each time it stood closer. By the end of the winter, all of them had vanished, leaving their houses abandoned and their families desperate for answers. The town grew quieter with each passing year, as fear took root. Even now, every winter, a new snowman appears in Black Hollow's town square. Its obsidian eyes glint in the pale sunlight, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen to its whispers. The Frozen Choir. The village of Silverpine was nestled deep in a snow-covered valley, isolated from the rest of the world for much of the winter. Its inhabitants were used to the harsh cold, but there was one part of the season they dreaded above all else: the arrival of the Frozen Choir. The legend spoke of spectral snowmen that appeared on the outskirts of the village each winter. Unlike ordinary snowmen, these figures were disturbingly lifelike, their faces carved with expressions of anguish. Their mouths were open as if mid-scream, and they were said to emit a haunting melody that drifted through the village on the wind. This year, the snowmen came earlier than usual. Kara, a schoolteacher, first noticed them during her walk home from the village square. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw a line of them standing along the frozen riverbank. There were 5 in total, each positioned as though they were facing her. Their coal-black eyes seemed to pierce through the gloom, and the faintest sound of humming filled the air. As she hurried past, the melody grew louder, worming its way into her ears and settling deep in her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. The tune played over and over, an unrelenting chorus that drowned out even her own thoughts. By morning, the village was buzzing with unease. The snowmen had moved closer, now standing at the edge of the main road. No one had seen them move, and no footprints marred the snow around them. Their number had grown too. There were now 10, their faces even more grotesque, with mouths stretched unnaturally wide. The melody intensified over the next few days, and the villagers began to change. Some claimed to hear voices whispering their names in the night. Others were drawn out into the cold, walking aimlessly toward the snowmen as if in a trance. They would return hours later, frostbitten and disoriented, unable to recall where they had been. Kara tried to resist the pull of the melody, but it was relentless. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it rise to a deafening crescendo. The walls of her home seemed to vibrate with the sound. When she could bear it no longer, she flung open her door and stepped into the night. The snowmen were there, arranged in a perfect circle around her yard. Their expressions had changed again, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. At their feet were strange glowing runes etched into the snow. The melody was no longer just a sound, it was alive, seeping into her body and compelling her to step forward. As she reached the center of the circle, the snowmen began to move. Their arms extended toward her, and the air grew unbearably cold. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was their mouths snapping shut, silencing the melody in an instant. The next morning, Kara's house was empty. The villagers found only a new snowman in her yard, its face frozen in the same expression of terror Kara had worn. Over time, more snowmen appeared throughout the village, their numbers growing with each passing winter. Now, the people of Silverpine know better than to linger outside when the Frozen Choir sings. But every year, someone fails to heed the warning, and the village loses another soul to the snow.